began to dig, the more I began to find the rootedness of border culture in a series of other really important things. And I mean, that's really what gets me started. There was no like anthropology degree that I wanted to follow. I was a literature student, and that was really what I was interested in, was writing. But I wanted, in my capacity as a writer, to begin to fill in those gaps on the library shelves, to contribute literature that is written by Mexican Americans for Mexican Americans, centered on Mexican American identity, culture, language, just concerns in general, and to try to promote that with my students, teaching middle school and high school, as I did for 14 years.
You may be interested in knowing that Mark Glazier, it was one of the first people who gave a talk at the museum.
That's amazing. Yeah.
In the late 70s, this museum innovated this Sunday Speaker Series program. And I think you've been a speaker at some of those, but Mark Glazier, as a young anthropologist at Pan American University.
Isn't that amazing?
Was really kind of, I think, was nurturing that stuff, the data sets. It would become como harina de otro costal.
Which was such an important book. Flower from the Sack, in its English version, was just a major eye-opener for me. Just the notion that our lives were worthy of study. I mean, this is something, the erasure that happens in public education can and does give young people the impression, often internalized, often not conscious, that in order to make it in the world of academia, they're going to have to turn their backs on their Mexican American identity, because that sort of thing isn't part of the realm of academic study. It isn't a part of the realm of scholarship, at least from the limited perspective that you're given in public school. And so, I did find myself as a high school student, after my parents had divorced, my dad had kind of abandoned the family, and his family had kind of pushed us away, at a crossroads. Was I going to double down on my mom's identity and that particular heritage? Was that my only way in, or was there a way for me to preserve what was most important to me, and that was my identity as a member of the Mexican American community? And luckily, Pan American University was the right place for me to be. I think if I'd gone elsewhere, I might have lost my way, but there were people like Mark, and just a lot of allies more than anything. The professorship at the time wasn't particularly heavily Mexican American, but there were a lot of people that realized they had to guide young Mexican Americans from the Rio Grande Valley along in a way that would help them to not abandon those things about themselves that they're so integral to their identities. Yeah.
I'm going to jump right into it, David.
All right.
Because
everybody's like, oh, where are the spooky stories? I don't hear about David's life.
Well, because look, I got to tell you that you wrote this compendium of ghost stories about the valley, but the one story about the museum is the one story that I can speak to, because I've now been working here a little over 4 years. And of course, I knew the story of Abraham Ortiz before I got here, because I was a consumer of this museum, especially the archives. But do you know that half the staff here at the museum believes that Abraham Ortiz's unsettled soul hovers, through the building?
Yeah, well,
now the other half, I have to tell you, the other half doesn't believe it. But there's a couple of staff members who swear that Abraham has come up from behind him and gone like this, o que le soplan en el oído. And so you decided that you would write a story about. You wrote a lot of other stories that are fascinating and compelling, but this one about Abraham is a fascinating story from so many different perspectives, because there's a trial, there's the accusation of a murder, there's the rape, there is an accomplice who flees into Mexico, there is the jail where the building continues to exist.
Right.
The room where he was brought to is there. It's part of our exhibit, of an
actual
exhibit.
Physical stuff that you can go and see. That's
the
right.
hanging room with the trap door. All of that is there.
Yeah.
And so how do you understand the story? How did you research to understand that story? And then how do you tell it?
Yeah, so researching it is like a three-pronged thing, because you go to the physical location and experience these things with your own eyes, see whatever descriptors are around, whatever plaques. Just, you try to get like a physical impression, because when you're writing it, you want to be able to give that texture to what you're writing. You do a lot of oral interviews, and you know about this stuff much better than I do. You talk to people. Obviously, the people at the time I was writing it that had been alive then had all passed away. There's really nobody still around. But there were children of people who were there, and grandchildren of people who were there who had heard these stories. And so you talk to people and find out, what people remember about it. And then you read a lot of firsthand accounts. You dig into the archives, you read newspaper stories, articles, and all of that. Those primary sources are the things that give the rich, like, reality, historical reality to things. And then you have to weave them all together. And when you're weaving them together, you have to figure out, like, what's my conceit here, or what am I trying to pivot around? What kind of feeling am I trying to create in a reader? And one of the things that in this particular book that I wanted to do was what can I teach them about history? And so, talking about the old courthouse meant also talking about the move of the seat of the county from Hidalgo to Canton, and it's being renamed
to Chapin.
To Chapin. That's right. It's being renamed Edinburgh, and like all the things that were associated with that, the documents that were being lost in the flooding down by the river, and like just how it made a lot of sense, and who the architect was, and like just creating this, because a lot of people don't really know this kind of history. They don't understand, what life was like at that time when we were moving from a farm, like a ranching community, into an agricultural, and town focused community. And it was a rich moment, and the kind of thing that I'd love to see like TV series made about, because it was a really, really fascinating time. I mean, something beyond Lonesome Dove, which gets half of it wrong. And so that's what you do. You weave it all together. Your focus is coming to the story of Florencia and Abraham Ortiz, how Florencia deals with, the ravages of being a survivor of that kind of like physical and sexual assault. And the remorselessness of Abraham Ortiz, so that as the reader's reading it, the reader wants to see justice done. The reader, even if the reader is like against the death penalty, is still like, this guy es un desgraciado. He does not deserve to continue in this community. And then just like, that the whole thing of his lingering, and the fact that then no one else has ever been executed again in that official way, because we know during La Matanza there are all kinds of people like Whispering Tom Mayfield who did all kinds of summary judgment on the field and executed Mexican Americans and hanged them from trees.
We have his guns here at the museum, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I love reading the plaque outside of the San Juan Hotel that like just speaks of him in like glowing terms, and you're like, guys, he was a murderer. Anyway.
So I want to situate ourselves in May of 1913, because that's when the hanging of Abraham Ortiz happens.
That's right, May of 1913. 2 years later, we will be in the midst of a real panic around the Plan de San Diego. A dentist, I think, in McAllen, is approached by a Mexican national who's brought with him this document written by Mexican nationals that is intended to try to convince Mexican Americans and indigenous people and black people throughout the U.S. Southwest to rise up against their white overlords and kill all men over the age of, I think it's 15 or 14 or something like that. Again, it's just a document. No one on the U.S. Southwest has signed onto this. Nobody even knows about it. But at the time, Whispering Tom Mayfield is a deputy, and takes this guy into custody. And what happens as a result is complete panic. A panic that the Mexicans on the border are going to create a revolution in the U.S. and that they're going to try to take the U.S. Southwest. And so 100,000 federalized U.S. troops are sent into the Rio Grande Valley, and there are a lot of field commissions given creating new Texas Rangers. And one of these people is Whispering Tom Mayfield, who had been working with John Klausner and other people in different capacities as a burly kind of butt kicker, right? And this was just like a wonderful opportunity. He hated Mexicans, and he used his position to, to torture and kill a lot of people. And in the Alamo City Park, the story goes, he hanged, shot, and burned, more than a dozen Mexican Americans and buried them in unmarked graves. And as a result, cuentan los viejos, the souls of these people are, they're restless. They ended up, the story says, in the San Juan Hotel, which is where he spent his remaining years after having been a lawman for a long time. Between those two periods of time, between being a Texas Ranger and a lawman in the Valley, he did a stint in Mexico as like a security guard for the U.S. Petroleum Company, for the American Petroleum Company. And one day he was talking smack about Mexicans in a cantina of all places and got his throat slit. And that's why they called him Whispering Tom, because he had a really raspy voice. He was also arrested by the Mexican authorities and put before a firing squad, but he escaped and came back to the U.S. And his plaque, issued by the Texas Historical Commission or whoever, in front of the San Juan Hotel, says this gleefully, as if the laws of other countries, so he was before a firing squad, ha ha ha, he escaped. He's a hero, yay. Which is a miserable, I don't, my mind can't wrap itself around like the racism that allows you to think that that's something.
Let me bring
admirable.
you back to the story of the ghost here, because I'm sensing that there may be some kind of denominator here in restless souls.
Mm-hmm.
So the restless souls that you speak of in the context of Whispering Tom, is that the same context as the restless soul of Abraham?
Well, I think they're restless for different reasons.
Okay.
Right? But I do think I'm a skeptic about all this, by the way. And
Yeah.
I do.
You're a skeptic about what?
I'm a skeptic about these places actually being haunted.
You just write about them.
but yeah, I know it sounds kind of like hilarious, but the reason I write about them is because I believe that the hauntings, whether they're real or not, are commentary on our collective trauma. And I think that every time we talk about restless souls, maybe at one level, even if there actually are restless souls, which I'm not going to flat out deny that there are, I'm just going to say I have no evidence that there are. Maybe at some level, the restless souls are a metaphor for the trauma that we collectively have to carry as a community, and that doesn't get reflected in history textbooks or whatever, but that if we're lucky, we have people in our family that tell us these stories and remind us, en ese lugar nos hicieron daño. En ese lugar hubo un hombre malo que quiso lastimar a nuestra gente. And you cannot forget it, because it can happen again. There was mass deportation at one point. There could be mass deportation again. It happened in the 30s. It happened in the 50s. Could happen again. There was lynchings of Mexican Americans in 1915. A century later, don't be surprised if that stuff doesn't happen again if we don't remember the lessons of the things that have happened to us. And one way of remembering it is to emblazon those lessons in the story of a haunted place. And I think that a lot of these places are about that. Yeah.
So a lot of it may be just self-expression of the kind of trauma that one carries as a result of whatever the sources may be.
Or
which makes
there
a
may
lot
be
of sense.
ghosts there. So I'm just saying, either way, or both, right?
Yeah, but you're a skeptic of the first.
Well, just because I haven't had a ghost attack me. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe the ghosts are like, oh, let him come in, let him write his little book or whatever.
But it's worth noting that unprompted, unprovoked, people walk into that place and feel something.
Oh, yeah. I tell you what, I went into the San Juan Hotel when I was doing this book. I was not supposed to, at the time, it was all boarded up and I was not supposed to go inside. But I went inside and I went into, I walked around and went into one of the many kind of like rooms that are partly open to the elements. And there was one room that I went into and the temperature dropped and it got really cold and it was summer. It was, typical Valley summer. It was 98 degrees outside and suddenly it felt to me like the temperature dropped into the 60s in that room. And I mean, it's cooler in the shade of the valley, but not the 60s when it's 90-something degrees. And so, I mean, there are things like that make me go,
But it would make a lot of sense that, say, in your own understanding of the lore, of the folklore, of, say, the Mexican tradition, because, as Eduardo Ruiz wrote in his book, Mexico, triumphs and tragedy, like this one elongated tragedy of Mexican history, which really means a lot in terms of people having their own kind of traumas, because there's a whole long trauma. And so, of course, in a place that has been ravaged by this and by that, people carry certain traumas with them. And how will those be expressed? Well, they're going to be expressed in a number of different ways.
Yeah.
Perhaps like this.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think that no matter what these stories ultimately signify in like an objective sense, I think that they need to continue being told. It's the reason that I wrote this book and that I've written other books that are collections of folklore, because I think that we need to remember what happened. And we need to remember the souls of those people, whether they're restless and lingering or not. Those were people who suffered, and their stories are compelling. And we ought to, when we go into places where something horrific has happened, we ought to feel something. Whether it's psychological, whether it's spiritual, we ought to feel something. And if we don't, I question our humanity.
Where does La Llorona most reign supreme north of the river?
Wow. That is a good question. So, there's like a Llorona in nearly every town, right? I was up in San Antonio I did a week of school visits in Northside ISD, and I would just say the word Llorona, and all the kids would, everybody had a different story. A lot of these kids who are from like Central America or from rural Mexico, or kids who are from Texas, everybody has like, a different version of La Llorona. And when I was a kid, my grandmother lived in the trailer park on South 10th, which is that hotel next to La Plaza Mall now. There used to be a little trailer park there. I don't know if you remember this in the 70s. And there was the canal on Ridge Road not too far away. And all of my primos would want in the summer to go out from her house to go swimming in the canal. Canal swimming, big deal in the valley. But, of course, there are sluice gates and there's irrigation time. And you don't want to be in a canal when the sluice gates are open and all that water rushes in. It's, lots and lots of kids have lost their lives that way. So my grandmother would tell us the story of a woman who, in 1915, had married a Texas Ranger and had a couple of kids with him. But then when all of that was over, he was called away and he never returned. He ended up getting married to a woman up in San Antonio or Austin. And when she got word of it, she was brokenhearted. Drowned her children, drowned herself, and now her soul wanders that place. Needless to say, I didn't want to get in the canal after that. I didn't even want to take a bath. I was 4 years old and just traumatized. But I think one of the most interesting ones is a very, very similar story that's told about the Resaca Los Fresnos, and a woman who used to wash clothes during that same period of time, and who wasn't watching her children. Because she was so distracted by having been abandoned by her husband, and they fell in the water and drowned. And as she dived in to try to save them, she drowned as well. And in the water, all of her anger and anguish and so forth curdled inside of her, and she became this thing that the ancients, the indigenous people that spoke Nahuatl, called Asowa Ehecatl, a woman's spirit, a crying woman. They also were called Chocani, Chocanime. The Llorona is a very old figure from hundreds of years before the Spanish ever came here. Both the Nahua peoples and the Maya people and other groups throughout Mexico talked about these women. There was a particular type of spirit called Cihuateotl, who was a woman who had died giving birth to a child. So she had never gotten the pleasure of being a mother and holding it in her arms. And now her spirit, which would accompany the sun as it, went down the sky into the west each evening, as the sun got closer and closer to the horizon, if she saw a child at a crossroads, she would try to capture that child, try to seduce it, try to call it to her, because she wanted to feel the touch of a baby. She had never been able to hold her own child. So this is really, really old stories that talk about, the trauma that specifically women and specifically mothers can suffer that maybe other human beings don't quite know as well. And so that's one of the reasons I find the Llorona story so compelling. I love some of the reinterpretations that I've heard in recent years from Irene Lara Silva or Guadalupe Garcia Macal or other Chicanas who are the version of the story of La Llorona that's mostly told is told by her husband, who discovers the children. And so it's all through the male gaze. We never hear the Llorona's voice telling us what happened. We assume that she drowned her children, but there are other possibilities. And I think that's really compelling as well.
Wow.
Why we immediately accept the mendacious and womanizing husband's story rather than seeking her out to hear her story.
What is it that people should know when they go trick-or-treating tonight? Because it is such a different experience to go trick-or-treating as it is to, say, to be immersed in Dia de Muertos kind of, remembrance and commemoration and even celebration.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I mean, one of the best ways to think about this is to think about what historically All Hallows Eve has been about. It's about tweaking the nose of evil. It's about, like, thumbing your nose, giving the middle finger, if you will, to all the bad in the world and say, this one night we will make fun of you and you cannot touch us. We are protected. And you dress up in all these costumes, even things as scary as birds, in order to not celebrate evil. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong. That's what it's not about at all. It's about sucking the power out of evil, of saying, this is something that we're going to, like, dress our children up as and laugh and have candy and so forth. And it's a preparation. It's a way to prepare for the coming of, our dearly departed. All Saints Days about those greater figures, and then All Souls Days about those people closer to us. And these traditions, even though they're Catholic traditions that were in existence before the Spanish invasion, have become, in our culture, like, all tied up in indigenous traditions, because in Nahuatl there are two words for dead person. There's Miki, which just means like a corpse, and there's Mika, which means a dearly departed person. And before the Spanish invasion, there were 2 entire months dedicated, not just 2 days, not a week, 2 entire months dedicated to celebrating our dearly departed. There was the Wei Mika Iluitl, which is the big feast of our departed dead, and that was for adults and great figures of kings and heroes. And then there was the Mika Iluitontli, which is the small feast of our dearly departed, and that was when you would celebrate the young ones who had passed on, or the people that were maybe less important in society. 40 days dedicated to thinking about the importance that they have in our lives. And, they would be, even though there weren't graveyards in pre-Columbian times, people were usually buried close to homes. They were, like, cremated and buried in urns under the foundations of houses, something like that, so they'd always be close. For 4 years after somebody's passing, there would be celebrations to help them on their way, because the different destinations that souls could go to in indigenous belief, whether it was Mictlan or
So Mictlan
is like,
would be different, right? Like El Venado Mictlan in the Yaqui tradition.
yeah, well, so Mictlan is like a place, right? In the Nahua tradition, it's a place. It literally means land of the dead. Mic is short for Miki, and then Tlan is place.
So El Venado Mictlan would be El Venado cuando lo matan and he goes into the place of death.
He goes into the place of death. That's right. Yeah.
But not dead. There's a reincarnation of El Venado.
For a lot of indigenous people, and I mean, you see that with the Huicholes, that the death of the deer is about bringing life to everyone else. And so in the Huichol tradition, the deer dies and becomes, medicine, becomes the kinds of plants, peyote specifically, that are then used for greater understanding and for the greater good of the tribe. But a soul in Nahua tradition would go into Mictlan, but only would spend 4 years there, or in Tlalocan if the person drowned or was killed by lightning or whatever, or the house of the soul, Tonatiuh Ichan, if you died in battle, or Cihuatlampa, if you died giving birth to your children. There were like 4 different destinations. You would spend 4 years there. They were almost kind of like purgatories. And during those 4 years, on the anniversary of people's death, not on Day of the Dead or whatever, but on the anniversary of their death, there would be 4 days of feasting and celebrating, making their favorite food, spreading marigolds all over the place where they had been buried. And all these traditions have been imported into our modern traditions of Day of the Dead. Although, like when you and I were growing up, Day of the Dead in the Valley? No, there was no Day of the Dead in the Valley. I had to explain this to my children. I have nothing against it, though. I think it's wonderful that we have found, we import so much like European stuff into our lives that I think importing something that's more indigenous and that arguably, because it's, a syncretic tradition, fits itself well into our mestizo lives.
Well, that's an interesting historical process because you're right that when you and I were coming up, it wasn't. But as you and I were coming up, it was beginning to gain root in San Antonio and in Los Angeles.
Yeah, especially Los Angeles, yeah.
And then people come up to those communities and they bring more of that.
Exactly.
And then, like this museum, there was a director here named Fran Alger, who back in the late 70s and early 80s, she began to play around with Dia de Muertos at this museum.
Yeah.
When in the communities there was nothing.
It was nothing, yeah.
And now it's an explosion.
Yeah, now it's like a wonderful thing. And if you haven't come out to the museum on Dia de Muertos, I really recommend it.
Well, no, that's 2 weekends ago we had about 5,000 people here.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
That came to see
that is
what we
yeah.
So let me go on break, and when I come back, I want to ask you where you learn Nahuatl and how it is that you continue to grow with that language and how that language is making its way into not so much this book, but some of these books that you have recently published.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Thanks.
So when we come back, more of our Museum Plática with David Bowles. Stay with us.
Roosevelt, all persons can sell their gold below market value to the government.
Enterré oro bajo de la casa. Úsalo para cuidar a tu hermano.
I found gold.
That's my gold.
That's my father's gold.
The jury finds the true owner to be...
It's a story filled with mystery, intrigue, and one's birthright. Dr. Garcia's gold exhibit is on display at the Museum of South Texas History. Go to mosthistory.org for more information.
Okay, friends of the museum, welcome back. Francisco Guajardo here with our guest for Museum Pláticas October 2023, El Dr. David Bowles. So, David, this is fascinating, kind of your own professional kind of path. You wrote a dissertation on a federal judge.
I know. You're like, wow, you really, how does this happen, right?
I remember I went to your dissertation defense, I think, on federal judge James de Anda.
Yeah.
And who was very important in the 1954 case of Hernandez versus Texas.
Yep. And then the Corpus Christi desegregation case in the 60s, yeah.
But then you went from doing like biography, which I guess there's a lot of overlap, right? To really moving into creative writing.
Yeah, sure. And that had, one of the things is, if to go back to my own life, is when you live in the Rio Grande Valley and you're rooted here and you have a family, you have children, you seek opportunities within the framework of what exists here rather than uprooting your family and going elsewhere. And so in my case, that meant, how can, I really want to study linguistics at a graduate level, but at UTPA, there's only an ESL degree and a literature degree. So I work with Lee Hamilton, the chair of the department at the time, and I ask him, can I just make my own master's? Can I grab the linguistics courses out of ESL and then take world literature courses and like a rhetoric course? Like, can I create my own master's that fits what I want to do? And he just said, all right, do it. I trust you. And there's a lot of that, a lot of trust from people in the institution where I work now, UTRGV. And I wanted to do a doctorate as well. There's no doctorate in English, no doctorate in linguistics. What is there a doctorate in? Educational leadership. So you make that work. And the story of James DeAnda was like really compelling to me. In the first place, you don't usually write a biography as a dissertation for educational leadership. It's usually some kind of, qualitative or well, I guess quantitative actually, discussion of the different types of data points from implementing something in schools. But because he was so essential to the fight for equity and education in schools in Texas, I argued that he was an educational leader and that his story demanded to be told. And I had a really great chair, Dr. Tevis, who herself was a scholar of a lot of
George A. Sanchez.
And definitely George A. Sanchez, but also other figures at that time, was definitely very supportive of it. So one of the things I found really compelling about Dan's life is he's light-skinned Mexican American. His family are immigrants. They live in the Italian neighborhood of Houston. He has lots of opportunities to pass as something other than Latino. And there comes a point after World War II, after he's gotten his law degree, and his friend offers to set him up with a job at the legal department of his dad's petroleum company. And he goes and he's filling out the form, and it's like, because it's right after World War II, they're really interested in where your parents are from. And it's like country of origin of your parents. And he's got to put Mexico. And he knows that the minute he puts Mexico, he's signing his own, not his death warrant, but he's like basically going to exclude himself from this position. And he does, and he realizes that he's got to take the privilege that comes to him from being light-skinned and passing and use it for the good of his community. And that just really spoke to me, because it is a dilemma that I think that a lot of white passing Latinos face, and that I faced, and there's a moment where you're like, I need to use this for good. And so that's really why I pursue him. And afterwards, as a administrator in central office in a school district in Donna ISD, frankly, to be honest with everybody, I am heading up, the training of and preparation of teachers and curriculum materials and so forth, trying to bring in more and more materials that are reflective of students' identities, that are student-centered, literature written in modern times by a diverse swath of people. And I realized that, that's what I want to be doing. I want to be contributing to that. I just start seriously going after publication. And by the time I'm 40, I published my first book. And here we are, 13 years later. I've published 36 books.
36?
36 books in these 13 years.
I was about to ask you, and I was expecting something like maybe 16 or 17.
Oh, no, 36 books. Because I'm including in those 36 translations that I've done. I do a lot of translating. From English into Spanish, Spanish into English, now into both of those languages. And also I issue my own books in both English and in Spanish wherever I can. So that adds the number. It maybe some people might consider that falsely inflating the number, but they're separate books. It requires an equal amount of work to translate.
You count them. You put those on those are lines in your Vita.
CD, in your Vita.
Did I hear you say Nahuatl also?
Yeah, Nahuatl.
So tell me how you come to this language of the indigenous people from the Valley of Mexico, and how you are able to develop your own proficiency with that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very circuitous and strange road. But as I'm doing that research into my family stories and the folklore of the valley and so forth, and how embedded that is in Mexico, I discovered that there were a lot of Nahuatl-speaking people that actually came with Escandon. There were multiple families of Tlaxcalteca living in Saltillo. They were Catholicized. They were, very different perhaps than their forefathers had been 200 years before that, but they still spoke Nahuatl. And they came along and they were brought with the more mestizo families from Saltillo to this area because it was kind of understood that as indigenous people that spoke an indigenous language, it would be easier for them to talk to the indigenous people of this area and get them to come into the missions and be tractable and so forth. And so a lot of these indigenous people were brought up. And so there was about 100 years in the early history of the settlements of northern Mexico and what is now, southern Texas, that Nahuatl was actually spoken here. When I discovered that, that to me just sparked a desire to know more. I was also at the time reading, the work of people like Francisco X. Alarcón and other people who had been playing with Nahuatl in their Chicano literature, and just becoming more and more fascinated by it. At that point, I had already studied a multiplicity of languages. I had studied Greek and Latin and biblical Hebrew, and had studied Japanese and French and Italian and German, just a bunch of languages. I've always been fascinated by language. And so I was like, how hard would it be to study this?
Excuse me for interrupting
Of course.
you, but we're looking here at, say, when the Escandon expedition comes. So you describe this as about 100 years. So you're looking at roughly between, say, 1755, 1760, and about the time of the Civil War.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's probably a little bit less than that. It's probably more up until just right after Texas it breaks off and becomes its own republic. So
now another question there. So then the kind of the introduction of Nahuatl, or its own version of Nahuatl.
Yeah, Tlaxcalteca Nahuatl. Yeah.
Given that this was spoken by a lot of mestizo people who had already integrated other different influences.
Mm-hmm.
But what about that age-old story of of Aztlan and the movement south, from Aztlan into the Valley of Mexico, and presumably Nahuatl would have migrated with that. What is the credibility of that story, and how, if so, would, say, Coahuiltecan or other native languages here have been influenced by Nahuatl centuries before Escandon?
Yeah, so I mean, here's a thing that here at this point we have to kind of separate, what is legend from what we know through archaeology and linguistic archaeology. A great friend of mine, Dr. Magnus Farrow Hansen, is one of the foremost experts in Nahuatl in the world, and I have lots of friends who teach Nahuatl at UNAM and Mexico City, and the consensus is that the place that the Mexica and other Nahua tribes came out of is not in the U.S. Southwest. It's El Bajío, which is the lowlands, kind of northwest of the Valley of Mexico, right? So they're coming out of an area that is geographically within present-day Mexico and traveling through La Huasteca in through the northern part of the Valley of Mexico. However, the Nahuatl languages, are part of the Utah Aztecan languages. And about 5,000 years ago, people left the U.S. Southwest speaking a Utah Aztecan language, the ancestor of not just Nahuatl, but of Tarahumara, Cora, Huichol, a bunch of languages spoken in the northern part of Mexico. And Nahuatl is the direct descendant of those languages. And so all these languages that are kind of spread through the northwest of Mexico, and all the way into Sonora, Coahuila, and south, they are all related to each other and have shared vocabulary and so forth. And so that is what you're suggesting is very true. So the people living along what's now the border between the U.S. and Mexico would have spoken languages that were, it's to some degree similar to Nahuatl. But not only that, the Triple Alliance of Anahuac, the Aztec Empire, had a huge trading web with routes that went all the way up into like Arizona, and they found all kinds of stones and jade and silver that geologists are able to determine are from the U.S. Southwest in towns in central Mexico, dating from around that time, and they found feathers from scarlet macaws and other birds in southern Mexico, in Arizona, New Mexico, and stuff like that. So there was like this really robust trade going on, and one of the things that was Nahuatl was used as a lingua franca all throughout Mexico. And not just during the time of the Aztec Empire, but afterwards, for 100 years, the Spanish used Nahuatl as their main missionary language, their main language of kind of like governance in a lot of these places. So Nahuatl got spread all over the place and was used,
So if you were to, 'cause you know that in the last maybe 5-10 years, the land acknowledgements have become very prominent.
Yeah.
And so if you were to do a land acknowledgement, what would the language be? A land acknowledgement in South Texas.
It would be really complicated. So I actually was contacted by TABE, the Texas Association of Bilingual Educators, asking me a similar question. They want to do a land acknowledgement for their meeting, I guess it was in McAllen recently. And they were asking, would we do it in Nahuatl? Would we do it? And I go, well, there were lots of Coahuitecan languages spoken here. But at present, we actually have a existing living group of indigenous Coahuitecan people here, the Comecrudo Carrizo Nation, who are they're in the midst of a language revitalization project. And I gave them the information so they could reach out to those people and to the head of that nation and get somebody, if they're willing to do it, because they might not be willing to do it, to come and do the land acknowledgement in Comecrudo or Carrizo. The languages are basically two different dialects of the same Coahuitecan
When
language.
would those languages have come here?
So those languages would have come here. I mean, they would have been spoken here for a couple of thousand years before the Spanish came. They were being spoken here for a very, very long time. And they are, some of those Coahuitecan languages are also part of that Utah Aztecan, kind of like spectrum of languages.
Right.
It's kind of fascinating.
So David, you have, like, your second to the last book. This is your most recent book, right?
Right, Prince and the Coyotes.
And this one was just published in 2023. So when you say that you published,
all those books came out in 2023.
so you're like a writing machine then. This one here is, I mean, they're all fascinating, right? But this one here, you have a 500-year span where you and Guadalupe Garcia McCall wrote this book where you actually have a young lady, Citlali, you call her.
Right, in the present day.
In the present day,
Right.
who actually goes into another era, 500 years before.
She's able to use this conch to communicate with people during the siege of Tenochtitlan, and she's can only be physically present like for brief moments when the moon is full, but she and this Mexica boy, are connected through this conch, which gives her the opportunity to help him escape from Tenochtitlan, but also to talk to figures from the past who, when he gets caught trying to escape. And so this
Such as like La Malinche, Malin
exactly,
Sin.
Malin scene. So it's a perfect opportunity. We were like, this is great because we can have a scene where we give a Mexican girl from the present, who is in at the time she does it, she's in ice captivity. She's in, she's been picked up by ice. She's in one of those cages. It's 2019, and she is able, in the midst of all of that anguish, to communicate with Malin Sin across the centuries. And Guadalupe Garcia McCall just did a fantastic job creating that conversation, because I'm sure there's so many women, so many Chicana and Mexicana women of the present day who would love to be able to have an opportunity to have that conversation, to talk to that person, try to understand and maybe forewarn Malin Sin, Doña Marina.
And what does she tell her?
She basically tells her, look, I know that you find yourself caught between these two great powers, and that suddenly you find yourself with power that you didn't have before, autonomy, agency, and it is your chance to see justice done. Because, Malin Sin is Popoloca. She's not Nahua, and her people were kind of like under the the yoke of the Mexica, but didn't have any particular love for them. And so this is her way of kind of like getting her revenge on the things that have happened to her. And Citlali tells her, but you need to get off this path because I'm from the future and I'm telling you, I know what happens. I know what they're going to do to you. I know what's going to happen to your son, the first mestizo child, and how they're going to take him from you. I know what's going to happen to your daughter and all the hardship she's going to endure. And I know that you've got 8 years to live, and then that's it. And your life will be short and brutal, and this power that you have right now is going to be gone, and you will be remembered not as a hero, not as somebody who got justice done for her people, but as a traitor, and you'll be vilified. And I don't think you should be vilified. And Citlali calls her mother, and it shows a lot of respect to her. But she's like, get off this path before it's too late.
Wow. Wow. Now, there's been a rehabilitation of Malintzin
Yeah.
in the last number of years, right? So
Sure,
that-
sure.
Yeah. But so this character of the young girl is actually covering the complexity of Malintzin.
Yeah. Which I think is really important because you can have like dudes writing about it all day long, but when you have a woman, you know, writing from the perspective of a young Mexicana speaking to this indigenous woman, having that kind of complex conversation, then we can all kind of step back and watch it unfold, and you know, be kind of like guests at that conversation, and sense the power of it, and sense the sadness that arises because, you know, if you have been sold into slavery and, you know, mistreated your entire life, and you get this one chance at and maybe pulling yourself out of that and maybe doing something that will put your people on a different standing than they have been in the past, it's hard to imagine anybody who not take that opportunity. And she just did not realize, she was awfully young, you know, just how duplicitous and evil Cortez was and what he was going to do to her. Yeah.
What's next for David Bowles in the 3 to 5 years?
Oh, well, I'm working on a TV series of my 13th Street books, which are like my spooky books for like young readers. Hoping to turn that into a TV series, working with Diego Molano, who did the Victor and Valentino series for Cartoon Network, developing it with HarperCollins production wing. So we're like super excited. We're going to start pitching that show to different streaming services really, really soon. Continuing to write more books. I've got another book coming out with Guadalupe Garcia McCall, which is like the sequel to the story of the volcanoes in Mexico, Ixtaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, set in the present day. Like what happens when the gods finally relent and they're like, okay, we'll bring her back. What does Popocatépetl do? She's a teenage girl in Reno, Nevada. It's got lots of like rich Mexicans. We were like, we don't want any poor Mexicans in this book. All the Mexicans are going to be rich, just like filthy rich, like with expensive cars. It was a lot of fun. Really, a really great accessible story, kind of like Twilight meets Romeo and Juliet, but with indigenous like Toltec stuff.
What are you doing tonight?
So tonight probably watch some scary movies. Unfortunately, my grandson, who was, they were staying with us for the last couple of weeks. He's off in Arizona with La Familia de mi yerno. So I won't have my little grandson to take trick-or-treating. But yeah, probably just give out some candies, watch a scary movie, just, probably write a little bit.
Wow.
Just try to take it easy, spend some time with my wife. Yeah.
Hey, so pull up that shirt, that Ernie shirt.
Yes.
Just so that the audience can see what we started here. I don't even know where I left. Oh, this is my mask, yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're Ernie, and
So check it out. Here I am.
Bert. Yeah.
I am Ernie once again.
So there's
Are we
evidence.
gonna put the mask
That's
on,
right.
or are we just gonna show it?
I think we're signing off now.
All right.
But David, thank you so much. This has been such a treat.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for inviting me.
Anytime we have you on some kind of museum program, it's always such a treat.
Yeah, and
So thank you
please
so much.
know that I am always available and willing.
Really appreciate that. Yeah.
Schedule permitting,
Yeah.
right?
Okay, so friends of the museum, we will see you in November for the next installment of Museum Pláticas. Pam, is there anything you need to say before we sign off?
Happy Halloween.
Oh, okay, yeah. Happy Halloween. Stay safe. ¿Qué les querías decir?
Pues nada, feliz Día de Muertos también. Bye.
Ajá.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, so long, everybody.
Take care.